It's been a bit of an anxious time for Oregon's largest private employer. A change at the top. A gargantuan new campus planned for suburban Ohio. Stocks took a big hit. But last week, Intel celebrated the completion of a massive expansion in Hillsboro, and the tech giant effectively reaffirmed Oregon's importance to its present and future. I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with you, Oregonian. Up next, business and technology reporter Mike Rogoway. We talked about Intel's big week, why the company renamed its flagship Oregon campus, what it can and can't do about its greenhouse gas emissions, and much more. Here's our conversation. Mike Rogoway, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, good morning, Andrew.
Mike, you've covered Intel for a very long time, and it feels like this past week was a significant one out in Hillsboro. Can you talk about what happened and set the scene for us out there?
The bottom line news was that Intel formally opened the $3 billion 3-year expansion of its D1X research factory. This factory is where it develops each new generation of microprocessor. And Intel is under extreme pressure after a series of technical failures to play catch-up with the rest of the industry, with the most advanced technology. And this $3 billion expansion builds a kind of factory that can accommodate new manufacturing tools, a new generation of what they call EUV, extreme ultraviolet lithography, get smaller circuits essentially onto the silicon wafers to make computer chips. These tools are enormously heavy. You fly them to the factories in a 747. They're the size of a school bus, and they're $130 million a piece.
Wow.
And the existing factory can accommodate the current generation, but the expansion will accommodate the next generation, a heavier, larger tool. And what Intel engineers there, it will then replicate at its factories in Arizona, Ohio, Ireland, and Israel. Being able to do this in Oregon enables Intel to move ahead on the next generation of technology. Well, not the very next, but 5 to 10 years. So this gives Intel some runway to play catch up and potentially restore its leadership position. The new CEO, Pat Gelsinger, has committed $80 billion to new factories around the world. Intel, before his arrival, had been considering outsourcing its manufacturing altogether, getting out of the manufacturing business, or at least offloading the most advanced manufacturing. He came in and did exactly the reverse. It's an enormously expensive bet. $80 billion is $80 billion any way you slice it. It's a lot of money for any tech company.
It's an all-in move, right? Putting all the chips, all the microchips at the center of the table.
Absolutely. Good phrasing. Yes, this is the classic bet the company move here that Intel is making. And it will be years before we know whether it's paid off. But at the very least, the new facility is pushing them in that direction. This is at their Ronler Acres campus. Ronler Acres was a housing development that Washington County approved in the 1950s that went absolutely nowhere. No one wanted to live there. Nothing got built for 30 years. And it became sort of a neighborhood dump. That's just where everyone took their junk. Well, Intel bought it in the early 90s and made it their most advanced manufacturing campus, which is, it seemed unlikely at the time, but they've got 2,000 PhDs out there. This is their research center. Yeah. And it's where some of the most advanced semiconductor engineering in the world is done. And they've renamed it for their founder, Gordon Moore, he's a co-founder and CEO. He's the guy who coined Moore's Law. And before this, they didn't have anything named for him. Their headquarters in Santa Clara, California, is named for their other co-founder, Robert Noyce. But they didn't have anything named for Moore. Now, Gordon Moore didn't live in Oregon. He didn't work in Oregon. He was a Californian. He's still living. He's 93. He lives in Hawaii now. But this is a landmark in that they finally have something named for him. And it is, their main research facility. So it makes a degree of sense.
So you glossed over Moore's Law there. I think a lot of tech people or computer savvy people would know what that means. But for the layman, what's Moore's Law? Yeah,
so Moore's Law was the notion, it's sort of a virtuous cycle, that the number of transistors that you could fit on a computer chip would increase exponentially. That would roughly double every couple years as the transistors, the features on the chip got smaller. And that did two things. It enabled more powerful computing. And because you can put more computing in the same space, it also enabled more efficient computing. And less expensive. So you had this virtuous cycle where technology became more advanced. At the same time, it became cheaper. And this was what Gordon Moore foresaw in the late 1960s and early 70s. He revised the law a couple times as the rate of technology changed. In the past few years, Intel at least has sort of bumped up against the limits of Moore's law. The features on the computer chips now are roughly the size of a few atoms, and it's very difficult to work on that scale. And Intel's inability to continue advancing at that called Moore's law into question. Now with these new manufacturing tools, they're hopeful that they can pick up the pace.
Okay, so this company, which is a fundamental piece of our daily lives and really kind of the tech world that we live in, this man Gordon Moore was a very important piece of this legacy and continues to be today. So, it goes without saying, but renaming this facility in Oregon, that says a lot, right? To name it for Gordon Moore.
Yes. And I think Ron Akers, was kind of an obscure name, even in Hillsboro. I think people knew what it was, but it didn't exactly trip off the tongue. And whenever we'd write about it, we'd have to explain what it was and where it was. If you drive out 26, if you're headed toward the coast, it's on your left. You can see it from the highway. It's sort of right behind Hillsboro Stadium, but it's behind wetlands. It's behind a giant parking garage, the manufacturing facilities. So you can't really see them. But, the Gordon Moore campus or their big administrative engineering building there is now going to be called the Moore Center. That sort of trips off the tongue a little bit better.
Okay. So,
one more thing, Andrew, I should note is that I mentioned that Gordon Moore didn't live or work in Oregon. He was, though, reputedly responsible for the company's decision to expand here. Keith Thompson, their original site manager, got recruited by Tektronix's board to come up and look about possible expansion here. And he had found a site at that time in Aloha and said, oh, well, maybe Oregon makes sense if we're looking for a new manufacturing facility. It's a quick flight from the San Jose airport. And Moore said, yep, let's do it, and signed off.
Okay. So there's that connection there. Intel is, I know from having covered the city of Hillsboro, it's not exactly an open door policy to come out to the facility there. So what kind of access did you get last week when you went out there? And can you describe just kind of what it looked like?
Yeah. So they're still, I haven't been inside their factories in several years. Even when Obama was out here to visit this campus in 2012. They didn't let him in the factory. They let him look in a window. They're very strict about letting people know, how their tools are aligned, what tools they're using. So when we were out there, the event they had, the governor, Kate Brown, they had Representative Bonamici, they had Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley were all there, as well as Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger. And before Gelsinger, no Intel CEO had done any kind of public event in Oregon, even though it's their largest site, in about a decade. They'd gone two CEOs without ever doing neither Bob Swan or Brian Kruzanich did any kind of public event in Oregon. They essentially it felt like they were looking down their nose at the state a little bit. They didn't really talk about what they did in Oregon. Gelsinger, who lived here for 30 years or so, maybe 20, as an Intel executive. He's much more in tune with what's going on in Oregon. And I should point out, he's also engaged in fierce lobbying on Capitol Hill. He wants $52 billion in subsidies for the U.S. semiconductor industry, much of which would flow to Intel and help pay for his $80 billion in expansion that he has on the drawing board in Arizona, Ohio, and Germany. And so he's getting to know the politicians in Oregon and around the country very well and getting them working for him to get that moving forward.
So we've talked on this podcast about the political situation that led to the expansion in Ohio. And so, I mean, what, if anything, should we make of this big to-do out in Hillsboro with the governor and both senators and obviously the congresswoman there and the CEO, as you mentioned? Is that a sign of, hey, we still love you?
Well, Intel's certainly trying to send that message. And I think one thing that I've been wondering, Intel has invested a lot in research in Arizona with Arizona State University. Mm-hmm. And now with their new Ohio site, they're getting in close with Ohio State University. And those are both very large, very established research institutions with engineering programs that really are on a scale that we don't have in Oregon. And so I think it was and probably still is kind of an open question as to whether or not Oregon makes sense in the long, long term for Intel's most advanced research. That said, very few of the PhDs, there aren't enough PhDs coming out of any one engineering program or any 10 engineering programs in the United States to meet Intel's needs. They're going to import them, whether they're from Ohio or Arizona or Berkeley or Palo Alto or Israel or Germany or Hong Kong. They're going to be importing a lot of their PhDs here. And so maybe Oregon makes as much sense as anywhere. But certainly having a CEO who lived here for many years, who knows the lay of the land, and is putting an emphasis on Intel's engineering and its research probably says something good for its future in Oregon. It doesn't seem likely, Oregon doesn't have the 1,000 acres that large semiconductor manufacturers are looking for now when they're building new factories. They call them fabs. There's no open parcel of industrial land in the Portland area like that. It won't be soon before we find such a thing. But if Oregon can sort of hold on as Intel's engineering hub, if they have a CEO who's committed to engineering, a CEO who knows Oregon, then that's probably a good sign. The company has 22,000 employees here. This is, as I said, its largest site. And it doesn't look like that's likely to change. As a share of employees in the company, Oregon is likely to drop, I think, over the next, as these new factories open. But its role may still be fairly central.
Put in perspective, how big is this Mod 3 expansion at D1X?
I think the whole thing is 1.1 million square feet, but I believe it's 270,000 square feet of clean room space. So that's equivalent to 2 full-size Costco's, and this is all manufacturing space. The rest is, sort of support. There's an enormous amount of tubing, ductwork, wiring, water to support the fab. But 270,000 square feet, I mean, it's just enormous. That's what it's adding to this facility. There are 2 other clean rooms that will now be attached of comparable size in the existing parts of the fab. So this is really just a very large facility. That said, 3 pieces together are probably the size of one of the fabs that Intel is building in Arizona, Ohio, and Germany. So as big as it is, it's still smaller than what's going on elsewhere. But for Oregon, I mean, if D1X, the whole research factory overall is called D1X, it's probably the largest capital investment in Oregon history. It started around 2010, and surely the total investment on it is in the tens of billions of dollars at this point.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about the timeline because I was out covering the city of Hillsboro when a piece of this was really moving forward, and we, I think, teamed up on a couple stories back in the day, which is like a decade ago now. So when we're trying to explain what exactly all of that investment from a decade ago does in practicality today, like is that, a chip that's powering your laptop that's now being made a decade later, or do we have any sense of, can you explain that?
Yes. So these are the most advanced chips. So if you're buying a Chromebook, maybe not, a more standard thing. But if you're buying, and now Apple uses its own processors, but if you're buying an HP or a Dell, a leading edge laptop, then yes, the computer chips, the microprocessor, the brain in your laptop was engineered there. And if you're buying it brand new, the chip probably came out of there too. So what Intel does is they'll ramp up the most advanced technology in these facilities, and then in Hillsboro. And then this copy exactly philosophy they have. They'll precisely duplicate the manufacturing environment, right down to the air in Arizona, and Israel has to be made similar to the air in Oregon, at least within in the clean room, so that everything acts just the same way. And so, but the first ones off the line come out of Oregon, and once they get the process ramped up at the other facilities, then they ramp down here and begin ramping up the next technology. Increasingly important to Intel is the data center market. It's hugely profitable, and a lot of our computing now is done, as they say, in the cloud. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what's engineered, at D1X will go first into data centers to provide the most efficient, most powerful computing. Amazon, Google, Facebook, they're really hungry for the most advanced chips. And there's increasing pressure on Intel from rivals AMD, NVIDIA, and others to create alternatives to Intel's technology, and they're making headway in that. Intel just a couple of years ago essentially controlled that entire market, and now they're still the dominant player, but the others are definitely eating away at it.
Okay. As you're talking there, I could just, in my mind's eye, hear the mayor of Hillsboro, Steve Calloway, and economic development directors being like, hell yeah, that's made in Hillsboro. And I could just see them smiling, and I'm sure they were smiling away in the crowd last week.
Well, and I think because Intel doesn't typically let people into its clean rooms or even see them through the window unless you're the president, and because it's surrounded by wetlands and a giant parking garage, it's kind of invisible to Oregon. We're not aware of this, but in economic terms, technology is as important to Oregon now as the forest products industry was in the 1970s to Oregon. This is our dominant industry. Our exports, jumped enormously last year, and most of the increase was semiconductors. This is our bread and butter industry, and semiconductors make up a slim majority of our exports overall. This is the heart of Oregon's economy.
As they say in Washington County, it's the engine of the economy. They like to call it out there.
Yeah. For sure. And it's, it's not just these 2,000 PhDs. And this was something else that Intel was doing out there last week. You can get a job making $60,000 or $70,000 a year to start with a 2-year community college degree as what they call a fab tech, fab technician, running the tools in these factories. And Intel is just really, and every chip maker in Oregon and across the country is really hungry for these workers right now. And so Intel was pushing new programs they're developing with Portland Community College and the Hillsboro School District that will push people, hopefully, they hope, quickly into this market. It doesn't take that long to train people up, but people have to commit to the training. Mm-hmm. And they're trying to point them to that direction and say, hey, here's a good job without a lot of upfront commitment for you on the education side that can lead to a long and lucrative career for you.
Well, let's take a quick break, then we'll come back and talk a bit more with Mike Rogoway, business and technology reporter for the Oregonian and Oregon Live. All right, Mike. So you had a busy week on the Intel front last week, and part of that was discussing, this company that has such a massive footprint. It's not all, sunshine and rainbows. There are emissions that come along with all of these innovative ways of making chips smaller and smaller and smaller. Can you talk a little bit about your reporting on Intel's emissions plans and kind of how they plan to address that and how they're hamstrung in some regards?
Yeah, every technology company over the past several years, technologists are scientists and engineers. There's no doubt about climate change within the technology industry. There's a universal belief that this is a major issue and that it needs to be dealt with. And for many of these companies, if you're Apple, for example, their solution is, well, we're going to rely on renewable power. We'll build wind farms. We'll invest in solar arrays. And that's the way we're going to move toward clean energy. It's more difficult with Intel. Intel uses a huge amount of electricity to run its fabs, but that's not the main source of its emissions. Most of its emissions overall come from the chemicals it uses to make these semiconductors, and they are high emitters of carbon equivalents and big contributors to climate change. And so What Intel said this past week is they're going to commit by 2040 to being net zero on climate emissions, essentially wiping them out. But the trick is that over the next 18 years, they're going to have to find some alternative way of dealing with their emissions through chemicals. And so they and other semiconductor manufacturers and their suppliers are looking for, new classes of chemicals that will not only do the same thing the ones do now, but do things better, because the industry has to be skating to where the puck is going to be. And, today's technology will be long obsolete in 2040. So they're engaged in research on that. It's an open question of whether or not they can deliver. It really isn't clear at all that they can. They said they've left themselves an out. They say that if they can't get there, they will go with carbon offsets instead, which is essentially investing in clean energy or rainforest protection or things like that reduce carbon impacts in other ways. But environmentalists hate these offsets. They say they don't really contribute nearly as much to reducing climate change as just simply not emitting as much. But Intel's made this commitment, and TSMC, their big rival, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing company, has made a similar commitment. The industry sees this as an issue. They recognize it. We'll see if they can get there.
Where does Intel currently rank in Oregon in terms of industrial polluters?
So Intel is number 7 among manufacturing polluters. Now, most of our emissions, or the largest single emitters in Oregon, are electricity generators, utilities, and gas-fired electricity plants. But Intel is number 7 overall, so they are a significant emitter. Of course, they're Oregon's largest employer, so per employee, it's not as much as Georgia Pacific, for example, is our largest emitter, and emits something like 5 times as much carbon equivalent as Intel does, and they're not nearly as large an employer. But Intel is one of our significant climate emitters, and we'll need to address that if they're serious about meeting their commitment.
Obviously, we talked about the notion of we're just going to pollute here, but buy some clean energy from over there.
These offsets.
The offsets, which are problematic in some people's view. And I understand that argument, but is there a symbolic argument that the Intel making this pledge symbolically matters given its stature in Oregon?
Oh, for sure. If Intel's making this commitment, if they can deliver it, they're our big, corporate workhorse, and, they're our industrial leader. And if they're pointing in that direction, then it certainly puts the onus on the other manufacturers to say, this is what we're doing. But when Oregon has proposed various climate reduction mandates, they've generally been written in such a way to excuse Intel.
Funny how that works, huh?
Yes.
What else are you working on, or you think we should hit on while we have you here in terms of the tech world?
It was a busy week this past week in Oregon technology. The same morning Intel had its big event in Hillsboro, which happened to be the day that on Monday, the day the big snowfall hit. Portland software company Puppet agreed to sell to a Minneapolis company, and Puppet, they play in an obscure world of software. They make DevOps, IT automation software. Essentially, they automate functions inside data centers and large computing networks that people would otherwise have to manage themselves. And in the time around the Great Recession, the tools to manage this technology were really rudimentary, and it was just very labor intensive and not fun. It was busy work, essentially. So we had a Reed College graduate, Luke Canese, started Puppet. He was a DevOps worker himself and said, this is a better way to do it. He created an open source product, Puppet, and it became extremely popular, very widely used. Coming out of the Great Recession, this was Oregon's most promising young technology company. We hadn't had a big startup breakout in many years, and it certainly looked like Puppet was going to be the one. They hired hundreds of people. They moved several times within just a few years, between 2009 and 2016. I think they moved 5 times, larger quarters. They need more space. They were growing so fast. And then they kind of hit a wall. Essentially, other tools emerged to manage these computing systems. And Puppets was one of them, but it was just one of many options out there. at that point. And so they went through a couple CEOs after Luke stepped down to try and find a new path. And it really never became clear. As recently as last year, they were planning for an IPO and planning to go public. And it didn't happen. It was clear that market had passed by. Now, they're still a large company. They say they do $100 million a year in recurring revenue. Mm-hmm. So that's a big business. They didn't disclose their sale price. The company that bought them, this Minneapolis company called Perforce Software, which is in the same market, they didn't disclose the sale price, but it's surely some multiple of $100 million. Their $100 million revenue. It wouldn't be shocking if this was $1 billion deal, and perhaps at some point that will come out when we'll have a dollar figure. So it's as Luke Knies, their founder, said, it's kind of a bittersweet moment. All acquisitions are bittersweet. He said nobody should start a company in hopes it becomes part of a larger company. And he said he does think this is as good an outcome for the company as it could make it for as many people as possible. The Portland office will stay. Puppet will exist as a product line and brand. Other Portland tech companies that have been sold over the last several years have essentially been dissolved. Some of them anyway. Others have done fairly well. But I think Puppet will still be an economic engine here for a while. But it's not going to be a big standalone tech company, which I think 7 or 8 years ago, there seemed to be a strong chance that it would become that.
And that's kind of the larger story is, Oregon and the Portland area, for the most part, it's like the outpost for companies, right? Where they have a sizable footprint, whether it's Intel,
more and more that had been
the
case, whether it's eBay or Amazon, which bought another Portland startup, Elemental Technologies. Apple has a presence here, HP, and of course Intel. We've been the outpost for a long time. Now, over the last couple of years, there have been some promising other companies, but they've kind of come out of left field. I think 10 years ago, you might not have pictured Dutch Bros as being it's Oregon's 5th largest company now by market value. And that drive-through coffee chain is really humming. And then we had a company move here, Expensify. They provide workplace expense software to manage your employees' expenses, mostly to small and mid-sized businesses. And their CEO had lived in Portland before, and he's moved back here. This was our first tech IPO since 2004 when they went public last year. They don't have a huge number of people here, but they do have the CEO. And it's sort of a sign that, between Dutch Bros, Expensify, there's another company, which Vacasa, the vacation rental management giant, they've all kind of got a place here now. And I think that there's a sign that, maybe we're not going to have a booming ecosystem of homegrown companies, but we're not going to be totally without them. They'll emerge every so often.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and thanks so much for chronicling all of it and taking time to talk about it.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with you, Oregonian. I shared links to some of Mike's recent Intel stories in the episode notes. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps others find the show, and tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism is through a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.